New York City, on Broadway, slicing straight through the heart of Manhattan. More than any street in the world, Broadway is synonymous with showbiz, glamour, and spectacle. If your dream is to be rich or famous, you're bound to end up on Broadway. Many of the world's greatest stars have made their mark here. In a city that is already larger than life, everything on Broadway is billed as the biggest, the brightest, and the best. Broadway, the heart of New York, the most spectacular stage in the world. Spanning 150 miles, 17 of them from Lower to Upper Manhattan, Broadway is one of the oldest and longest streets in America. New York's most celebrated street is also its spine, connecting north to south, dividing east from west, intersecting virtually every famous neighborhood in the city. Wall Street and the Financial District, Herald Square and the beginning of the Garment District, Times Square and the Theater District, and Columbus Circle, the gateway to Central Park and the Upper West Side. Several centuries ago, Broadway was a dirt path used by the Algonquin Indians. In the 1600s, the Dutch turned it into the main road of New Amsterdam called the Great Common Road, the Great Highway, or Broad Wagon Road. Because of its unusual width, it soon came to be known as Broadway. As the street and its buildings extended northward, small parks and squares were set aside for the city's residents, and the first and oldest park in New York was just off Broadway, Bowling Green. Architectural historian Barry Lewis has led countless walking tours of Broadway that all start here.
We're here in Bowling Green, which is actually the beginning of Broadway. This is where it all began. Broadway starts right over there on the west side of Bowling Green. Number 1 is right over here. When the Dutch founded New Amsterdam in the 17th century, this was their main recreational square. The center of the city actually was on the East River, but this is where they did their bowling, their golfing, and mostly their fighting and their arguing and the things that New Yorkers do well. It was all done here in Bowling Green. Broadway was the only road that brought you from the north directly down Manhattan Island to the heart of the city, Wall Street. In this city, which is the most capitalist of cities, the money was made on Wall Street, but it was spent on Broadway. So Broadway became the nexus for the nightclubs, the fancy restaurants, the theaters, the opera house, and of course, all the great department stores.
The Broadway we know today, the street of spectacle and showmanship where culture and commerce collide, began with a vision of one man, Phineas Taylor, or P.T. Barnum, the greatest showman on earth. In 1841, at this corner of Lower Broadway and Ann Street, Barnum bought an abandoned building and turned it into the American Museum. He immediately drew in the crowds with his exotic animals and what he called his human oddities. The dog boy, Madame Clefoulia, the bearded lady, General Tom Thumb, the world's smallest man, Chang and Deng, the Siamese twins. Combining the instincts of a crook with a genius for publicity, Barnum's philosophy was simple. There's a sucker born every minute. In 1865, the American Museum caught fire, and the curious menagerie spilled onto the streets. Vultures and parrots flew across Broadway, while snakes slithered underfoot. When the flames died down, the only sign of Barnum's popular museum was a dead whale lying in the middle of Broadway, a sight that made even the most jaded New Yorker stop and take notice. Broadway has been a street of high and low culture. By the late 1860s, Lower Broadway between Union Square and Madison Square was the most elegant shopping district in the city. New Yorkers called it the Ladies' Mile. The first department stores in America were built here, catering to the city's fabulously wealthy elite. The Ladies' Mile was so popular that people from around the world came to shop, or to catch a glimpse of leg, as the wind tunnels from surrounding skyscrapers offered a cheap thrill to passing voyeurs. The term 23 skidoo was coined here at Broadway and 23rd by police who patrolled the street for oglers and told them to skidoo or scram. Also at this intersection, the Flatiron Building was erected in 1902, one of the world's most memorable skyscrapers, which still provides one of the city's most extraordinary views. That's Broadway on the left. The 20-story Flatiron Building became a classic symbol of New York architecture and a favorite subject for artists and photographers. The building's unique shape was like the prow of a luxury liner, ready to set sail into a new century. The Flatiron Building symbolizes the height of New York's golden era, when many of Broadway's classic buildings were constructed. New York's growing immigrant community of Irish and Italians risked life and limb for paltry wages to build New Yorkers these priceless cathedrals of commerce. Further up Broadway, across from Herald Square, is Macy's, once billed as the world's largest department store, and still famous for its elaborate Christmas windows.
My Broadway windows are the main windows at Macy's. Just like a theater on Broadway, I have openings.
Macy's windows are designed by Sam Joseph.
We change those windows 40 times a year, which is a lot of changes. 7,000 people at this time of the year pass those windows per hour.
The window displays and Macy's annual Thanksgiving Day Parade attract millions of spectators to Broadway. The parade announces the beginning of the Christmas shopping season and is one of the city's most spectacular examples of conspicuous consumption.
The first Macy's parades were very, very simple parades. There were no big balloons, there were no big bands. It was just simply the employees themselves having a parade. They had floats, but they were very, very rustic. I mean, nothing compared to what it is today. But except for the one thing that our employees still actually do all the parades. The balloons were let go at the end of the parade and floated away in the sky, and people brought them back to the store for a reward, which is pretty amazing, because nowadays I don't think people will bring them back.
Americans love pageantry, and the ticker tape parade was invented here, in the canyons of Lower Broadway, to celebrate the country's greatest heroes. In 1927, Charles Lindbergh was given the biggest ticker tape parade in New York history, after completing the first solo transatlantic flight. 4 million people came out to celebrate the man who had conquered the skies. For one day, he had also conquered Broadway. If Broadway is the spine of New York City, then Times Square is the nerve center. A 24-hour sensory overload of pulsing neon billboards, crushing crowds, and some of the worst traffic jams in the city. Here, the streets are ablaze with perpetual neon and giant TV screens. Illuminated billboards burn corporate logos into the unconscious minds of dazed shoppers. A billboard here can cost as much as $3 million a year, making it the most expensive public advertising spot in the United States. With its concentration of theaters and television studios, there are more celebrities per square foot here than anywhere else in the world. This gives many of the 40,000 New York cabbies something to brag about.
Jack Dempsey, Jacqueline Kennedy, George Hamilton I have picked up. I picked up Marilyn Monroe with Arthur Miller. I even got a kiss from her. Marilyn, she was a sweetheart. And the white dress, a strapless dress, gorgeous. Muhammad Ali I picked up when he was Cassius Clay. I picked up, what's his name? He used to work with Johnny, with Johnny's Carton. Here comes Johnny. I picked him up.
Sam Goldstein has been driving a cab in New York City since 1953. He's traveled over 2 million miles, thousands of them up and down Broadway.
Broadway used to be very bad, Broadway. All the undesirable people they used to hang around. Thank God for Rudy Giuliani. He fixed it up. And Broadway is just like Broadway used to be. Broadway used to be the entertainment, you know. Now over here used to be the Capitol Theater. I show you the building, but they took it down. See, everything changed there.
Times Square has often drawn sailors, streetwalkers, and other transients looking for a quick fix or a cheap trick. By the 1960s, there were more strip clubs and sex shops per capita here than any other location in the United States. And crime was up there too, with an average 200 pockets picked per day.
I remember the old Times Square and I avoided it. I haven't been back here until I got hired to work.
In the 1980s, a campaign to clean up the mean streets of New York returned Broadway to its earlier reputation as one of the most tourist-friendly destinations in the world.
Oh, it's great now, and it's getting better. Cleaner out here, it's a lot cleaner, a lot more tourists. Times Square then was like another world.
Like so much of Broadway, Times Square is continually reinventing itself. The square owes its name to the Times Tower at Broadway and 43rd. The New York Times opened the imposing structure in 1904 and occupied the building for only 10 years. But the tower itself and its famous electronic billboard is one of the city's best-known landmarks. Another classic landmark on the east side of the square is the Paramount Building. When the Golden Art Deco Tower opened in 1926, over 30,000 visitors poured in on the first 2 days alone. Frank Sinatra, America's first pop star, gave some of his most famous performances here and caused a near riot on the streets. In 1944, tens of thousands of frenzied fans jammed Broadway to catch a glimpse of their idol. The hype was manufactured by Sinatra's handlers, but the hysteria was real. Sinatra crooned, the girls swooned, and the Bobby Soxer phenomenon was born. The pursuit of fame is a time-honored tradition on Broadway. Here, self-promotion rivals raw talent as the ticket to success. No one understood this better than Andy Warhol, the self-proclaimed prostitute of the art world. Warhol had his studio on Broadway on the 6th floor in this building overlooking Union Square. This was the home of Warhol's factory in the late 1960s, the hottest address in New York City. For 6 years, Warhol held court here with an entourage of divas, glamour boys, superstars, and groupies, and became the media darling of the art world. Art dealer Vincent Fremont was a witness to the Warhol phenomenon in the 1960s.
Well, Andy Warhol was a magnet. He attracted a lot of creative people from music, from art, literature. And if you came to New York, you invariably ended up seeing Andy. Well, Andy came to Union Square through Paul Morrissey, who worked with him in filmmaking, and they were looking for a new loft space. The attraction to downtown, lower Broadway, there were a lot more lofts with cheaper rent. There's lots of air and light, which is important to artists. But Andy was kind of a pioneer down here. There weren't that many people involved in the art world. The factory became, a destination. If you were an English rock band, your publicist made sure you had lunch with Andy Warhol. And fashion, lots of fashion people. And he was the center of for creativity and for crazy people that would show up, some to the detriment of them being almost assassinated by one.
Valerie Solanas was one of the factory's fringe players and author of the Scum Manifesto, Scum being an acronym for the Society for Cutting Up Men. Solanas wanted to create a swinging, groovy, out-of-sight female world, which meant killing all men, including her old buddy Andy. One afternoon in 1968, Solanas waited outside the factory for Warhol to arrive. An agitated Solanas rode the freight elevator, following Andy into his studio. She pulled a .32 caliber pistol from a paper bag. Her first 2 shots missed, but the third punctured Warhol's lung. He was pronounced clinically dead. 5 hours later, the pop art prophet was revived. His 15 minutes weren't up yet. As for Solanas, she made her way up Broadway to Times Square and turned herself in. For many people, Broadway symbolically ends north of Times Square at Columbus Circle. Although Broadway runs for another 10 miles in Manhattan, the mood of the street and the city changes from commercial to residential. In the upper reaches of Broadway at 175th Street, the former Lowe's Movie Theater is now a United Church. Yet even here, bullets can still be heard over Broadway.
I was standing over there, the kids were starting to come out at 2:45, and there was 2 cops starting to chase some bandit or whatever, suspect, down that way, running up in the middle of the street with their guns, bang, 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 trying to catch them, but I don't know if they caught them or not.
The Broadway Bridge marks the end of Broadway and Manhattan, and the entry point for many of the city's 1 million commuters. But the soul of Broadway, what has inspired countless songs, books, and movies, is as much a state of mind as it is a place. That's the Broadway of American theater. For over a century, the world's greatest performers have tested their talents and done some of the craziest things in order to get on the Broadway stage. Theater is big business in New York, drawing over 10 million patrons and generating over $500 million in revenue a year. Over 40 theaters span a 6-block radius of Times Square. This is the Great White Way, so called for its abundance of marquees, neon, and flashing lights, all competing for attention. Broadway has been home to American theater since 1895, when Oscar Hammerstein built his palatial 6,000-seat Olympia Music Hall between 44th and 45th Streets. It was replaced by the Ed Sullivan Theater, now home to The Late Show. Since the invasion of mega musicals in the 1970s, led by Andrew Lloyd Webber, the theater district has experienced a full-fledged revival. A recent smash hit on Broadway is Disney's The Lion King, winner of the 1998 Tony Award for Best Musical, playing at the New Amsterdam Theater. Actor Christopher Jackson performs the role of Simba.
Just about every single show, I'll come off of the train, and I always like to go to the front of the theater. The thing that I did opening night, I came out and I saw my name up on that placard. It's almost as if it didn't really happen. So I like to kind of remind myself of what I do every night and what I'm a part of. And part of that ritual is going and checking that board and making sure that my name is still there. And to see my name on that board was really a dream come true. Broadway represents a tradition of excellence in performance, and for just a die-hard attitude when it comes to being on stage.
The New Amsterdam Theater has showcased Broadway performers with stars in their eyes since the early 1900s. The Ziegfeld Follies were the most elaborate and lavish musical revues ever staged on Broadway, drawing busloads of beautiful young women with dreams of making it in the Big Apple. Each girl was personally chosen by Ziegfeld himself, and according to the maestro, a great showgirl had specific requirements. Bust, 36. Waist, 26. And hips, 38. Night after night, Ziegfeld's theaters were packed full of gangsters, millionaires, and talent scouts. After showering the girls with roses and jewels, stage door Johnnies expected and usually got a good time. Some performers went on to great success, but many died of drug overdoses and alcoholism, tragic victims of Broadway's excess. Ziegfeld also made Broadway his home. He lived in great style at the Ansonia on Upper Broadway. At one time, it was the city's largest and grandest apartment hotel, featuring over 2,000 rooms. On one floor, he kept a permanent suite of 13 rooms where he lived with his wife and daughter. One floor below, he rented a second set of 13 rooms for his mistress. In the 1970s, the Ansonia had become notorious as the home of the Continental Baths, the place to be for gay New York. The original swimming pool and saunas in the basement of this huge hotel were transformed into a giant bathhouse. Many famous performers played at the baths, but the greatest diva of them all, Bette Midler, got her start here in 1972 and came to be known as Bathhouse Betty. Several years later, when disco was all the rage, the Continental Baths were again transformed, this time into Plato's Retreat, the first club to openly cater to swingers, heterosexual couples who like to swap partners. Today, Broadway has evolved. Sex and scandal have given way to entertainment suitable for the whole family. Now it's mini autograph hounds who rush the stage door when beauty makes an appearance. And for 10 seconds each year, the eyes of the world are on Broadway for the biggest and brightest spectacle of them all. At the turn of the millennium, nearly 2 million people gathered in Times Square to ring in the new year. It was a giddy, gaudy celebration topped off by 3 tons of confetti. From Barnum's Exotica to Ziegfeld's Erotica, from Lower Broadway's ticker tape triumphs to Times Square's Millennium Madness, from low life to high life, Broadway has seen it all.